All right, so today we're going to take a look at chapters 5 and 6, which are both very short chapters and both work very nicely together. Chapter 5 is very simple. It raises the question, what is the question? And the whole point of these pages is to remind you that you need to know the actual question in order to tell if the argument answers it or not. So you want to know whether or not the argument that you're looking at answers the actual question that's being raised. And just as an example here, if we were to take a look at page 70, the first one there at exercise 5-2, it says, when we consider how splendidly the planets are arranged in their orbits, how the Earth is positioned at the right distance from the Sun, how the eye is designed to see and the hand is fashioned for grasping, we must conclude that it was all arranged by some higher, greater intelligence. And so, what's the basic question that's being asked here? It seems to be, the question is there a higher power, a being that is responsible for the creation of the universe? Now, once we know that that's the question, we can look at the argument and ask ourselves, does the argument try to answer that question? Don't worry about whether you agree with the argument or not, but does the argument try to answer that question? And the answer is yes. Right? It talks about how the planets are arranged in an orbit around the Sun, how the Earth is just the right distance. It's not too close to make it too hot. It's not too far away to make it too cold. It's just right for sustaining life. You look at how the eye works or how the hand works, and clearly they argue there has to be some kind of design that makes it so. This couldn't happen naturally. And so the argument seems to be gearing towards that idea of trying to prove that everything was created by a higher power or a higher intelligence. So it does look like the argument is trying to answer the main question. And that, quite honestly, is all that Chapter 5 is concerned with. It's a very easy concept, and it kind of, in many ways, goes back to stuff that we've done previously. When you look at an argument, and questioning whether or not the premises lead you to the conclusion. And that is what leads us into Chapter 6, which is what I'm going to turn to now, the much more interesting and useful chapter. Chapter 6 raises the question of relevant and irrelevant reasons. Okay. And basically, we want to make sure that an argument that we're looking at, if we're considering it, we want to make sure that the premises are relevant to the conclusion, to trying to prove the basic point. And so the first thing you have to do, of course, is to determine what the conclusion is. You learned how to do that back in Chapter 2. Look for your conclusion indicators, or what is the more controversial claim, or perhaps if there's no indicators, look to the first line of your argument. But figure out what the conclusion is first. Then look at the premises and ask yourself, are these premises relevant to the conclusion or not? To be relevant, they have to be talking about the same thing, not different things. Remember I gave you the one example a while back about how, what was it, when a few presidents were married, therefore the next president will be under 40, right? And the conclusion had nothing at all to do with the premises. So that's irrelevant. There's no relevancy between the two, therefore the argument is not going to be good. So you want to make sure that the premises and the conclusion are talking about the same thing. And you want to make sure that they are building towards or trying to work towards proving that conclusion as being true. So that's what you're looking for. Are the premises relevant or not? So if the premises are relevant, then the argument is worth considering. You should look at it, you should treat it with respect and evaluate it to its full merit. But on the other hand, if the argument is not relevant, if the premises are talking about something different from the conclusion, if the premises don't lead you or direct you towards that conclusion, then they're not relevant. So you should probably discard that argument, throw it away, because it's probably a fallacy. And you know that all fallacies are going to be invalid. So there's no point in wasting your time with them. Okay. Now, of course, once we get into this, we should realize that we should only look at arguments and should only consider arguments where the premises are relevant to the conclusion. But there are a lot of people who try to trick you, who try to pull the wool over your eyes and get you to accept things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise choose to accept. And that's where the fallacies come into play. That's what you have to learn to watch out for. Now, in this chapter, it talks exclusively about what it's calling the irrelevancy fallacy. So if you choose to just say to call the irrelevancy fallacy in general, that's fine. But technically, even though the book doesn't go into it, technically there are two fallacies that are very similar but slightly different that make up what the book is calling the irrelevancy fallacy. The first one is called missing the point. The other is called a red herring. A missing the point fallacy occurs when the premises of an argument supports one particular conclusion, but then a different conclusion is drawn. Okay? So as you know, you are constructing an argument, your premises are supposed to lead directly to that conclusion. But in a missing the point fallacy, a person will start off by making a statement or maybe even an argument that should lead to a logical conclusion, but instead they choose to make it lead to an alternative conclusion, one where it doesn't follow directly. And that's why it's called missing the point, because you've missed the point of the argument. Here's an example of that. Crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing lately, so we should reintroduce the death penalty immediately. Well, if you have an argument that says crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing lately, that could lead you to a conclusion that maybe we need more police on the street. It could lead you to a conclusion that maybe we need harsher penalties for theft and robbery. But it's not logical that it should lead you to the idea that we should reinstate the death penalty, because a person doesn't get the death penalty for theft and robbery. Those crimes don't warrant the death penalty. So the conclusion does not follow directly from the premises. It's an irrelevant premise to that conclusion, basically. So it commits this fallacy of missing the point, or irrelevancy. Okay? It's missed the point because it's taken you to a different conclusion than the one that you should have been led to. The other fallacy, which again, very close to this, which is probably why the book links them together just as the irrelevancy fallacy, but the other one is called the red herring. Get this to come up here properly. Okay, so the red herring occurs the same way that missing the point does, but in this case the arguer is going to add something that's intended to throw the listener off the track. It makes the deception more subtle. The term red herring is derived from the Old English fox hunts. When they would go out to hunt the fox, the hound would get the scent of the fox. And once they've got that scent, they're not going to let go of it. They're going to hunt it and chase it until they've caught that fox. But sometimes you had to call off the hunt. And so what they would do would be to take a herring, which is a very smelly type of fish, and they would rub it in the tracks all over where the fox had been, so that when the hound got up to that point, all it could smell was that smelly fish, and it would lose the scent of the fox. and then you'd be able to pull it away. And that's what's happening in a red herring fallacy. You are taking your argument and you're leading a person towards one conclusion, but then you subtly throw something in there, right? You throw in these smelly fish, and it leads the reader off the track, and they end up following through to a different conclusion without actually realizing it. So it's the same basic idea, it's missing the point. Your premises are not going to be relevant to your conclusion, which why, again, it could be just referred to, as the book does, as irrelevancy fallacy. But it's a more subtle form than the missing the point. The missing the point should be obvious, whereas the red herring should be a little bit less so. Okay. So here's an example of a red herring fallacy. Environmentalists are always complaining about nuclear power, but electricity is dangerous no matter where it comes from. Every year, hundreds of people are injured by electrical accidents, so people should show greater care when using electricity. Okay. So we start off with this argument about how environmentalists are complaining about nuclear power. And then we switch in this subtle little section here about electricity being dangerous no matter where it comes from. Well, nuclear power and electricity are two very different power sources, and the argument our conclusion should be leading us to is about nuclear power. But instead, by putting that in, we've shifted the emphasis and ended up creating an argument that led us towards claiming about electricity. Well, that's the red herring, right? What we start with is what we should end with. We shouldn't be led astray or allow ourselves to be led astray like this. So if I start by talking about how environmentalists are always complaining about nuclear power, I need to talk about the dangers of nuclear power and maybe get to a conclusion about how we need to show greater care about nuclear power. But I don't do that here, right? Because we've subtly slipped in this statement about electricity, hoping that our listener or reader is not going to notice the difference. Because after all, they're both power sources, right? And so it allows me to come to a very different conclusion than the one that I logically should have come to from the beginning. So that's the idea behind the red herring. We're into political times again now, and political times are always great for watching for irrelevancy fallacies and questioning about the red herrings and the missing the points. And actually, if you look at presidential debates, gubernatorial debates, and so on, you see a lot of times this is what's happening, because these politicians, they have their pet subjects that they want to talk about. And no matter what question you ask them, they're going to find some way of subtly shifting it over to this other area. Okay. Sometimes they're really good at it. If you go back and look at some of the speeches that President Reagan gave, he was a master of this. He would start off talking about one topic. He'd tell one of his folksy back home's stories, and before long he was off on a completely different topic, completely different tangent, and most people never noticed because it just flowed so nicely and his acting skills allowed him to get away with that. But if you look at somebody like the second President Bush, his was more like the missing the point. He would talk about an issue, and he didn't have the capacity to subtly shift and wind things the way that Reagan did. Instead, he would be talking about one issue, and then boom, just like that, he's talking about a different issue. And so it becomes a question of missing the point. But you can see that and kind of watch this as you're looking at the political stuff that's going on now, because quite honestly, I don't think either one of these are presidential candidates that we have right now are great orators or speakers that are going to know how to manipulate things well. They're going to manipulate things, they both are, but I don't think you're going to see them manipulating it well. So you're going to see probably more of the missing the point than you will the red herring aspect. But anyway, that's the thing that you have to get from this chapter is, can you tell the difference between an argument that the premises are relevant or irrelevant? And so on page 83, you have exercise 6-1, and it's going to ask you just very simply, are the premises relevant or irrelevant? Do they commit the irrelevant reason fallacy? So it's not even asking you specifically for missing the point or red herring. It's just saying the irrelevancy fallacy, is it relevant or irrelevant? So let's look at the first one. It says the Alaskan oil pipeline is certainly not a threat to the environment of the Alaskan tundra, through which the pipeline passes, or to the Alaskan coastal waters. For after all, it is essential to the economic well-being of the United States that Alaskan crude oil be shipped out of Alaska through an efficient pipeline. Alaska contains the largest oil reserves in the United States, and we must have access to those oil reserves if we are to avoid costly and risky dependence on foreign oil supplies. And the Alaskan pipeline is the most cost-efficient method of making Alaskan oil available to the rest of the United States. So quite clearly, the pipeline does not threaten the ecology of the Alaskan tundra or the Alaskan coastal waters. So to figure this out, the first thing we have to do is to decide what the conclusion is. The conclusion seems to be that the Alaskan pipeline is not a threat to the ecology of the Alaskan tundra or its coastal waters. Now we want to ask, are these premises relevant to that point? Well, ultimately no, because the conclusion wants to talk about the ecology aspect. But if we look at the premises that are being given, they all seem to be talking about the necessity of it. We know that it has to be shipped out of Alaska through an efficient pipeline. Alaska has the largest supplies, cost efficiency, right? So the arguments here are dealing with things like economy and necessity of having oil. They're not talking about whether or not the ecology of the area is going to be affected or not. And so the premises do not speak directly to what the conclusion is concerned with, which means that this first one does in fact commit an irrelevant reason fallacy. In the way it's stated here, I would argue that this is probably more of a missing the point than a red herring if you care about that. But again, as far as the book's concerned, all you have to do is say that it's an irrelevant reason fallacy. So it commits that irrelevancy. Okay? So I'm going to let you try some of these. How about if you do 2 through 10? 2 through 10, just telling whether the premises are relevant or irrelevant to the conclusion. And when we meet up on Thursday, we'll go ahead and check through those, and I'll answer any questions that you have at that time as well. All right, so have a great day.